Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I wanted to make this video about a subject that tends to get overlooked, but it's incredibly important. What do you do as a musician about playing gigs and being in recovery? And this is a topic that is incredibly important, and it's not something to just gloss over. Now, over 12 years ago, when I got into recovery, I had some gigs left on the books by some miracle. I had burned a lot of bridges. A lot of people didn't want to have anything to do with me because of, the usual pitfalls of addiction, but I had some of them. And I do not know exactly how I managed to stay clean and go to those gigs except by sheer tenacity. Because, I believe a very big part of recovery is, you make this decision that I'm going to stay clean come hell or high water. However, you need to stack the deck in your favor. And I was very, very lucky at one of those gigs. I ran to somebody else that was on the gig that was also in recovery, and he recognized the key tag I had, and he was very supportive. But if I was to counsel somebody else in a similar situation, I would tell them, look, you probably want to cancel those. Say, I'm very sorry, but, this is very important. I don't want to die. And so I need you to, find somebody else for the gig. I didn't do that, and I managed to get through it, but I would not recommend that. And then at that point, I stopped playing out. I realized that I needed to change everything that I was doing. And so when you get into recovery, whatever treatment modality you're in, doesn't really matter. But if you're going to meetings, you go to meetings. If you're doing something else, some other kind of program, you do that other kind of program. You do that. You change just about everything you're doing in terms of who you're hanging out with, where you go, what you do. And the last place you need to be is someplace that's going to expose you to the very substances that you don't want to use anymore, especially when there's all these associated stimuli and triggers and what have you, because when I went to these gigs, that's what I did. Of course, I used all the time, but I also got to drink there and, especially for free and all that kind of good junk. And if you're watching this video, you probably know. So for a very long time, I just did not play gigs out. I started to play with one band who I had ties with before, and all we played was outdoor festivals, and it was a lot of fairs and town events, and even outside senior centers. And we went down to Pennsylvania for this thing called Music Fest, this really big thing. But there were places where it wasn't inside a bar. And that was something I started to do, a little bit. And I had this accountability thing going on. One of the things that I found out, and a completely different arena of my life, which I talk about on this channel. I had maybe a couple of years clean, whatever it was, and I went to a role-playing game convention, and it was in my town. It was a small one. There were people I knew there. And I knew that there was going to be some drinking there. And I didn't tell anybody. And I went there. And at some point, I'm sitting next to people later in the day, and they're having a beer or something next to me, and it became a little bit uncomfortable. Part of me was repulsed by it, and part of me said, gee, that looks kind of good. So I called my sponsor, and he said, you needed to tell somebody before you went to a place like that. And you need to have an out, and you need to have some people that you were accountable to. And if you got uncomfortable, you could call them. And if you, didn't need to put yourself in a situation where you couldn't get out of there. And so he kind of bitch slapped me a little bit, if you'll excuse the term. And I said, yeah, you're right. He said, I know I'm right. But it was one of those reminders that if I was going to expose myself to something, that I needed to tell people, that I needed to have some kind of accountability, that I couldn't just go in there completely defenseless or without telling, somebody that that's where I was going. And so I started doing that. If I went to a party or something like that, I'd go in and say, hi, I got to go now, guys, and split. But I let people know that's where I was going. But still, I wasn't playing gigs for a good long time where I was going into a bar. And probably not until I had about, I guess, maybe 8 years clean, somewhere around there. And a friend of mine had called me and said, hey, can you play this gig? I have this guy, Cancellation, and so can you please play? And I'd played with him a bunch before. I said, sure. I went there. I let people know where I was going. I said, well, this is a test run. Let's see how this goes. And it went okay. I didn't feel uncomfortable. It had been long enough that I hadn't been using, that I had a lot of defenses built up. But I'm talking about years. And I still let people know where I was going. And I still got the advice, if you're uncomfortable, you need to be able to have an out to get out of there. Now, of course, I'm going to a gig, so I can't just leave in the middle of it. So, I did kind of leave myself wide open. But I remember before that, when I would go to concerts, I talked to my sponsors, the other people that had been around for a lot longer than me. And he said, when you go to a place like that, and you go with friends, if one of you is comfortable, you're all uncomfortable, you all leave. I absolutely, I actually had an experience not so long ago, maybe about 3 years ago, where I went to a concert with a friend, a concert I really wanted to go to. And we only stayed for half of it because they became uncomfortable. I realized, that we needed to leave because they were uncomfortable because a lot of people were smoking tons of marijuana. Of course, nowadays it's so pungent, you can smell it from like 3 miles away, but you get the idea. I don't need to go into it. But I had to honor that and leave, even though I didn't really want to, but I was there and I was their ride. And so that's what we did. But getting back to gigs now, I've had to be really, really honest. I don't tell a lot of people that I'm in recovery. In fact, honestly, now that I'm doing it on this YouTube channel, that's probably the most I've ever mentioned it to the outside world. Generally, I kept my anonymity pretty close to my vest. And I have reasons for disclosing it now. But the people in the bands that I play with, generally, I will let them know I'm in recovery. Some of them already know. And, it's just one of those things. Sometimes you'd be surprised who else you find that's in recovery. Most of the time, not so much. But I let them know, hey, listen, I'm not going to be drinking. I'm not going to be doing all this stuff. They know. And it's not like they look out for me, but I have that extra layer of accountability. I let people know where I'm going. I don't do it as much now, do it as much now because I gig all the time. But it was something I had to be very, very careful of and very, very honest about. And I remember, gosh, it was probably a couple of years ago, somebody put down a tray of drinks for the band. And it was like some kind of tequila shots or whatever it was. And they started talking to me. And I said to myself, wow, gosh, I could just drink all 4 of these right now. And that probably really wouldn't be enough. And so I let the other guys in the band know, you need to put them over there. I'm not going to have one, but they're just too close to me. And I've noticed that a couple times where that happens. I just need to tell somebody and be honest about that. So far, I've been fortunate that I've been able to go back out and gig. I'm very honest with myself. At set break, I don't hang around with everybody else. I usually hang out on stage. Sometimes I'll go out to my car. I don't need to be hanging around with people in a bar. I'm there to do a job. And, I kind of sequester myself from the rest of the people. And, maybe that, is a little off-putting to people, but I don't care. That's fine because my recovery comes first. And I really enjoy playing music. I enjoy playing music out for people. Sometimes it can be a bit sad to watch, people in that environment, especially when you go to one of those dive bars where it's full of a bunch of people that really probably need recovery. But you just kind of have to watch them helplessly as they do that, and they behave in the ways that we tend to behave, and we get that loaded. So it's just sad, and sometimes it's more of just hey, I don't want to go back there. But it's one of those things where I've had to remain vigilant and honest. And should it ever become a real issue, like man, this is really starting to talk to me, then I would need to adjust what I'm doing. So, and I had years before I started doing that. I have good friends that played out a lot that have more time than I do, and they still won't do it. And it's still that much of a paired stimuli for them that they don't want to do it out in a at least in a bar, in someplace like that. So it's something to be very, very conscious of. I'm very glad that I was able to start playing out again, and now I'm able to do it a lot, and was able to enjoy it, and even going to to places that are a little bit more or seedy or what have you. Because it's really a big part of my life, and I'm glad it's back. But it's something that I had to filter through the lens of recovery and wait until I felt like I had enough defenses, and even then, be honest enough to say if I need to pull the plug on this, I'll pull the plug on it. So far, I haven't had to, but it's something not to be taken lightly. Yes, music is a big part of a lot of our lives, and playing out is a huge thing. But in the grand scheme of things, I would pick the recovery first. You know what I mean? Because I don't want to go back to the life I had. I like the life I have now. I don't have to pawn any of these things, which is pretty cool. So that's been my experience. If you're struggling with this, I'd love to hear from you. If this is something where you have experience as well, I'd like to hear from you on that. If this is something that just you've never really thought about and you're wondering if you can go back, let me know too. Have a good one, kids.